So, India is making this huge bet on solar power to fuel its future. But, this isn't just about putting up panels anymore. It's about making them from scratch, right at home. Let's dive into this really high stakes plan to see what's going on. And you can see why the vision is so massive, right? For a fast growing economy like India, the demand for energy is just immense. Tapping into the sun on this kind of scale, well, it's not just an option, it's an absolute necessity if India wants to hit its economic and climate goals. It's a pretty inspiring picture of a cleaner, more energy-independent future. But here's the real kicker, the question at the heart of our entire explainer today. See, it's one thing to import and install solar panels. It's another thing entirely to build the whole supply chain, from the raw silicon all the way to the finished module, domestically. That is the multi-billion-dollar challenge. Now, to tackle this head-on, the government didn't just cross its fingers and hope for the best. Nope, it came up with a very specific, high-stakes plan. So let's take a look at the problem it was trying to solve and the massive incentive scheme it created to do it. Okay, so the core of this whole strategy is something called the Production Linked Incentive Scheme, or PLI. The idea is actually pretty simple, but it's also really powerful. Instead of giving out money upfront just to build a factory, the government pays companies an incentive based on what they actually produce. It's a direct push to get those machines running and build a real homegrown industry. And we're not talking about small change here. The government put up nearly $2.8 billion just for solar manufacturing. That number alone tells you exactly how serious India is about breaking its reliance on imports and building its very own solar ecosystem from the ground up. So, the big question is, did it work? Well, at first, on paper, the response was nothing short of a boom. Seriously, the initial results and all the industry announcements, it looked like an absolutely incredible success story. And wow, just look at this timeline. It shows you how incredibly fast things were supposed to move. From getting approval in late 2020, the first awards were already out within a year. And check out the jump between the first and second tranches, from under 9 gigawatts to almost 40. The plan to scale up was just breakneck. The numbers from this period are just staggering. The first auction, oversubscribed 5 times over. Domestic manufacturing capacity for modules and cells exploded by hundreds of percent in just a couple of years. It drew in everybody, from huge industrial giants to specialized solar companies. On paper, this looks like an absolute slam dunk. But then came the reality check. Because all those promises made on paper are one thing. Actually turning them into functioning factories and power plants, that's a whole other challenge. And this, right here, is where the story takes a fascinating turn. So you had all these amazing headlines, right? A manufacturing revolution. But what was actually happening on the ground, the story of steel and concrete and functioning production lines, that started to look very different from the press releases. Okay, now this chart, this really tells the story. Look at the full height of these bars. That's the capacity that was promised and allocated under the scheme. Now see that darker bit at the bottom? That's what was actually built and operational. While module assembly is over halfway there, the really crucial upstream stages, the hard stuff, are lagging way behind. We're talking just 10% of the promised wafer capacity and 14% of polysilicon is online. That's a massive, massive shortfall. And if we put some big names for those numbers, it gets even clearer. You can see here that while a couple of players like Adani and Tata Power have hit their marks, several other major companies, including Reliance, Shirdi Sai, and Wari, had literally 0% of their promised upstream capacity built by the deadline. So what happened? Right, so this huge gap, it didn't just happen by accident. The research points to 4 big hurdles that really slowed this whole dream down. Let's break them down, one by one. The first hurdle was basically policy confusion, all centered around something called ALMM. You can think of it as a Made in India approved list for solar panels. But the government kept changing the rules. Sometimes it was enforced, sometimes it was suspended. That created huge uncertainty for investors. I mean, why would you build a factory if you're not sure you'll even have a protected market? Okay, hurdle number 2, it's all about the money. Just look at the cost difference here. It's relatively cheap to set up a factory that just assembles the final modules. But to actually make the wafers, the step right before that, it costs more than 4 times as much. The amount of capital you need for that true upstream manufacturing is just immense, and that's a huge barrier to entry. Third, while India's plan was ambitious, you have to look at what was happening elsewhere. The US, for example, rolled out its Inflation Reduction Act. It provides about 17 cents per watt in support. That's more than 8 times what India was offering. And on top of that, the US offers upfront cash and tax credits, while India pays its incentives out later. For an investor, it's a no-brainer which one is more attractive. And finally, the last big hurdle. You just can't build this stuff out of thin air. You need the machines and you need the experts. Nearly all the critical factory equipment has to be imported from China, and so do the expert technicians you need to install it all. But with a stunning 99% reduction in visas for Chinese nationals after the pandemic, well, getting those experts on site became a massive bottleneck, causing all sorts of delays down the line. All right, so after going through all those hurdles, where does that leave India's big solar bet? Well, the general verdict seems to be that the PLI scheme has definitely built a foundation, but it's a long, long way from being the self-reliant fortress that was originally envisioned. And this chart here is kind of the final report card. It sums it all up perfectly. Against a target of 65 gigawatts of new capacity, you can see that just under half was actually achieved. And the investment numbers tell the exact same story. Only about half the targeted capital actually came through. So the big takeaway is that the scheme delivered about half of what it set out to do. It's a significant achievement for sure, but it's a partial one. And I think this quote from this source report really just nails it. The PLI scheme was a catalyst, no doubt. It turned a policy idea into actual, tangible factories. But that journey towards true self-reliance, where India can make everything it needs, that journey is still far from over. And all of this leaves us with a really big strategic question for the future. Is the goal of building every single part of the solar supply chain, from the silicon all the way to the panel, actually the right one? Or would it be smarter, maybe, to focus India's investment and policy on the parts of that chain where it can realistically build a world-class competitive edge? That is the big question facing policymakers today.